December 30th, 2014, from Bank of America Stadium in Charlotte, North Carolina, was the Belk Bowl between the Georgia Bulldogs and the Louisville Cardinals. The Cardinals got the ball first. They started off with it on their own 20, but after 7 plays, they would punt from their own 49. So now the Bulldogs would take over on their own 10-yard line with a little less than 12 minutes left in the first quarter. And they would move the ball to midfield and into Louisville territory. And on 2nd and 14 from the Louisville 45, Hutson Mason dropped back to pass and hit Conley for a 45-yard touchdown pass that put the first points on the scoreboard. With the score now Georgia 7, Louisville 0. So now the Cardinals would take over on their own 16 after the kickoff with about 8.5 left in the first. They would bring the ball to midfield and into Georgia territory into the red zone. And then down toward the goal line, they got a 1st and 10, but they lost a yard. And then a penalty brought them back another yard. So now it's 3rd and goal from the 12. Kyle Bolin hit Gerald Christian for the 12-yard touchdown. And this game was tied up at 7 apiece between the Bulldogs and the Cardinals. So now Georgia would take over on their own 9-yard line after the kickoff with about 4.5 left in the first. They got a penalty on the kickoff, and so they're backed up against their own end zone. After 9 plays, they would end up punting from their own 29. So now Louisville will get the ball on their own 20 with just seconds left on the clock in the first. They give it to Brandon Radcliff. He ran at 11 yards for the first down to the 30. And that brought the first quarter to a close. So after 1 quarter of play, the game was tied up at 7 between Louisville and Georgia. Now to open up the second quarter, the Cardinals had the ball on their own 30, but they would end up punting from their own 35 after 4 plays on the possession. So now Georgia would take over on their own 34 after the punt with 14 minutes left before halftime. They would get into Louisville territory, and their drive would end up stalling on the 23, and out would come Marshall Morgan to attempt a 41-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and the Bulldogs were in the lead by 3 with the score Georgia 10, Louisville 7. So now the Cardinals would take over on their own 30 after the kickoff with 11.5 left in the second quarter. After 5 plays, they would end up punting from their own 37. So now Georgia would take over with 9 minutes on the clock before halftime. They head on their own 24. And on 3rd and 9 from the 25, Hutson Mason dropped back and hit Sony Michel for a 32-yard reception. It was now 1st down on the Louisville 43. And then they got another 1st down, and it was a 1st and 10 on the 31. Nick Chubb then ran it 31 yards for the touchdown to put the Bulldogs up by 10 with the score Georgia 17, Louisville 7. So now the Cardinals would take over on their own 14 after the kickoff with less than 7 minutes left before halftime. And Reggie Bonifant was intercepted by Dominic Sanders. And so now the Georgia Bulldogs would have the ball 1st and goal on the 9. But they weren't able to get into the end zone, and out would come Marshall Morgan to attempt a 22-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and the score was now Georgia 20, Louisville 7. So now the Cardinals would take over on their own 26 with 5 minutes left before halftime. They ended up being faced with a 4th and 5 from the 31. They elected to go for it, in an incomplete pass would turn the ball over on downs. So now the Bulldogs would take over in field goal range on the Louisville 31 to start the possession with 3.5 on the clock in the second quarter. Bryce Ramsey then was intercepted by Terrell Floyd. And so now Louisville would take over backed up against their own goal line on the own 3-yard line with about 3 minutes left before halftime. After 9 plays, though, they ended up punting from their own 45, so they get the ball out to midfield. Now after the punt, Georgia would take over, and they would just let the clock wind down and go to halftime. So at halftime, the score was Georgia 20, Louisville 7. So now to begin the second half, Georgia got the ball first. They had it on their own 30 after the kickoff. They would get into Louisville territory. Then on 2nd and 9 from the 31, Sony Michel fumbled the ball. It was forced by Lorenzo Malden and recovered by Lorenzo Malden for the Cardinals. So now Louisville took over on their own 32. They got a 1st down, and there was 1st and 10 on the 47 of Georgia for the Cardinals. Kyle Bolin then dropped back, and he was intercepted by Dominic Sanders for the 2nd time in this game. And now the Bulldogs would take over on their own 35 with 10.5 left in the third. But after 4 plays, they would end up punting from their own 48. So now the Cardinals would take over on their own 20 with a little less than 9 minutes left in the third, but after 5 plays, they would punt from the Georgia 46. So now the Bulldogs would take over, backed up against their own end zone on their own 3-yard line. It was about 6.5 minutes left in the third, and they gave it to Nick Chubb, and Nick Chubb runs it all the way 82 yards across midfield and into Louisville territory down to the red zone for the first down on the Louisville 15. Then they gave it to Sony Michel. He picked up 13 yards. That made a 1st and goal on the 2, and then Sony Michel punched it in from 2 yards out, and the Bulldogs are now up by 20 with the score Georgia 27, Louisville 7. So now Louisville would get the ball with less than 6 minutes left in the third. They had on their own 30. They would bring it down into Georgia territory. It was 1st and goal on the 6, and Brandon Radcliff ran it in from 6 yards out for the touchdown. It was now Georgia 27, Louisville 14. So now Georgia would take over with less than 2 minutes left in the third quarter. They had on their own 27 after the kickoff. And on 3rd and 11 from the 26, Bryce Ramsey at Chris Conley for a 14-yard reception, a first down that would bring the third quarter to a close. So after 3 quarters of play, the score was Georgia 27, Louisville 14. So now to begin the fourth quarter, Georgia had the ball first down on their own 40. And they would end up being faced with a 4th and 1 on their 49, and a penalty of offsides against Louisville would extend the drive for the Bulldogs and give them a first down on the 46. Then on 3rd and 7 from the Louisville 43, Nick Chubb ran 8 yards for the first down to the 35. They were then faced with a 4th and 11 from the 36. They decided to go for it. An incomplete pass would turn the ball over on downs to the Cardinals, who would now take over on their own 36 with about 10 minutes left in this game. But on first down, Bolin dropped back. He was intercepted for the 3rd time, but not by Sanders, this time by Damian Swan. And so now the Bulldogs would take over on their own 33 with 9.5 left in the fourth. They would end up bringing it into Louisville territory. Their drive would stall on the 24, and out would come Marshall Morgan to attempt a 41-yard field goal. It was up, it was good, and it was now Georgia 30, Louisville 14, as the Bulldogs led by 16. So now the Cardinals had the ball on their own 9-yard line, backed up against their own end zone. After a penalty for an illegal block on the kickoff, there was just over 5 minutes left to play in this game. They needed 2 touchdowns and 2 two-point conversions to send it to overtime, but instead they went 3 and out, and so they punted from their own 10. So now Georgia would take over on the Louisville 45 with a little over 4 minutes left on the clock. And on 3rd and 3 from the 38, Nick Chubb ran 30 yards for the first down to make a 1st and goal on the 8. They gave it back to Chubb, and he punched it in from 8 yards out for the touchdown. And it was now Georgia 37, Louisville 14. So now Louisville would take over on their own 12-yard line after the kickoff with about 2 minutes left to play. And they would bring the ball into Georgia territory. They got all the way down to the 10-yard line. But on 2nd and goal from the 10, Kyle Bolin dropped back, and he was sacked by Lorenzo Carter for an 18-yard loss. And that brought this game to a close with the final score, Georgia 37, Louisville 14, as the Bulldogs win the Belk Bowl. They came into this game ranked 13. Louisville was ranked 21. Georgia is now 10-3. Louisville's 9-4. And in this game, Hutson Mason was 10 for 15 with 148 yards passing and a touchdown. Bryce Ramsey was 4 for 9 with 51 yards passing and an interception. Nick Chubb was the game's leading rusher for the Bulldogs and for the game in general. He had 33 carries for 269 yards and 2 touchdowns. Sony Michel had 11 carries for 31 yards. And for Louisville, Kyle Bolin was 20 for 40 with 301 yards passing and a touchdown and 2 interceptions. Brandon Radcliff was the leading rusher for the Cardinals. He had 19 carries for 91 yards. And the leading receiver in the game was for Louisville. That was Devontae Parker. He had 8 receptions for 120 yards. Eli Rogers had 5 receptions for 81 yards. James Quicks had 2 receptions for 57 yards. And for the Bulldogs, Chris Conley was their leading receiver with 4 receptions for 81 yards and a touchdown. And Sony Michel had 1 reception for 32 yards to go along with his 31 yards rushing. There was lots of picks in this game. The Bulldogs had 3 picks. Dominic Sanders had those 2 picks, and Swan had 1, Damian Swan. And for the Cardinals, Terrell Floyd had an interception as well. But the Bulldogs dominate the Cardinals in this game, and they win with a final score, Georgia 37, Louisville 14.